In this lesson, we are going to learn about an alternative way of parsing the JSON using the CocoaPod that we added a couple lessons ago, SwiftyJSON, all right? So go ahead and open up a browser and do a Google for SwiftyJSON. Let's go ahead and take a look at their documentation real quick. So let's go ahead and scroll down here. And right off the bat, it tells us the problem that SwiftyJSON is trying to solve. And we already saw a little bit of that here. We have to cast it as dictionaries. We have to cast it as types and provide alternative default values if we don't want it to be nil. And so it's kind of a pain. And they show that very well right here. They give the example of working with a Twitter with the Twitter API and say you want to retrieve a user's name value of some tweet. You first have to try and do the JSON serialization. You have to cast it as an array of dictionaries. You have to go and drill into the statuses array to get the user. And then finally you can get the user and you have to cast all the way down to the username. And so that's kind of a pain. And with SwiftyJSON, they show us here, all you have to do is create a JSON data object with this JSON convenience initializer that they provide. And then you can call the JSON, and you can actually kind of drill multiple levels down in the JSON to the point that you want. In our API, we don't actually have any nested JSON objects, so we haven't had an opportunity to take a look at what is going on right here. But basically, you can have JSON objects inside JSON objects within JSON objects. And so what this is doing is taking the first JSON object, and then it's finding another JSON object inside of that one with the user or with the key of user. And then inside of that JSON object, there's another JSON object with the key of name or a property of name. And so you're able to very quickly drill down to the level that you need to get the information that you need. And it says here, don't worry about the optional wrapping thing. It's done for you automatically. So it still has, if you do .string, it will still have the optional. But what I really like about SwiftyJSON is if you come down here, we have, let's see here, non-optional getters, okay? So here we have something called .int value, .string value, .array value. So if you have value at the end, what it's doing is it's going to return a non-optional. So if it's nil and you do int value, it's going to return 0. If it's nil for a string, it's going to return an empty string. It's essentially doing for us what we did right here. So we are trying to cast it optionally as a string, and if not, then we provide a default value. That's exactly what it's doing here. So if we say .string value and it's nil, it'll automatically return an empty string for us, which is really nice. And so we don't have to handle that case of, oh, what if this doesn't exist, or what if it's nil? We can just provide it a default value. Now, granted, that's not always what you want to do. Sometimes you need to handle the case in which it is nil. But for the cases where you don't really need to do anything if it's nil, if you just want to provide a default value, this is fantastic. All right, so let's go ahead and see how this is going to change. So again, I'm going to keep all of the functions that we create in this class, just so you can reference them if you like. I'm going to call this a parsing function using manual methods, okay? And then above it, we're going to do parsing with SwiftyJSON. All right, and it's pretty similar still. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this function and paste it here. And we're going to call this parse person Swifty. Okay, and we are going to come back to this function here in a second. We're actually going to create a new Alamo file request because the way that we handle the JSON is a little bit different. So I'm going to copy this function, and right here, I'm going to paste it, and we're going to say web request. Oh my, web request with Alamo Fire and SwiftyJSON. And I'm going to keep the same name, so we're actually just going to comment out this function here. Okay, so all of it's the same except for right here where we deal with getting the JSON. So if we come back to the SwiftyJSON documentation, we get the JSON from the data, okay? So we're going to initialize a JSON object here. So instead of getting JSON right here, we want data because we need to initialize the JSON from the data. So instead of JSON, we want response.data, and we can get rid of this right here. And there we go. Okay, so we're saying guard let data equal response.data, else return completion nil. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this right here as well. Now what we're going to do is we need to create a JSON object from that JSON initializer that SwiftyJSON provides us. The problem is that that throws an error. So do you remember how we handle throws? We dealt with that here with our .json object, which throws an error. So what we need to do is a do catch block. So I'm going to say do, and then we're going to catch. And here in the do, we're going to go ahead and create our JSON. We're going to say let JSON equal try. So we're going to try to create a JSON object. And so this is a quick tip. If you are trying to use a method from your library, just like I just did, and it's not popping up, it's probably because you forgot to import it. So we need to import SwiftyJSON. There we go. All right, so let's try that again. Try JSON, and there we go. So here it says it creates a JSON using the data, and you can see here data throws. Okay, and we're going to pass in the data that we just unwrapped right here. All right, so if that is not successful, then we are going to go ahead and print that error. So debug print error dot localized description, and we will do completion nil so that we know that it was unsuccessful. And then I'm going to cut this and paste that right here. And we're going to say let person equal, and then we're going to self.parse person Swifty, but instead of passing in a dictionary of key string type any, we are going to come down here and we are going to pass in JSON, just like that. All right, so come back up here and pass in the JSON. Perfect. All right, so now we need to adjust our parsing function. And so right here, what we can do is instead of having to do this cast and provide a default value, all we need to do is say JSON with the key of name, and then we say dot string value. And that is it. So I'm going to do that for all the rest of these, dot string value and dot string value. Okay, so this one here is a little bit different though, okay? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna get rid of this, and we are going to say instead of dot string value, because this is an array of strings, the film URLs, vehicle URLs, and Starship URLs, what we need to do is say dot array value. And so that is going to create an array of any types, okay? So what we would end up with here is an array of type any. So we need to convert those types to strings. So calling on our new knowledge of closures, we can say dot map, which is going to provide a transformation on each element in this array. And what we want to do is convert it to a string value. So we can say $0 dot string value, and that will go through and turn each element in this array of types any to an array of type strings. And we can just copy that and paste that here and here. All right, very good. So now we have our function that is parsing out this data using SwiftyJSON. And you can see the two functions here side by side, and it doesn't make a huge difference as far as the number of lines of code or the amount of code, but having to not have to do this over and over again is super nice. And maybe we'll have an example later on where we have some nested JSON objects, and that is where SwiftyJSON really shines, because then you are able to immediately directly drill down instead of having to do a whole lot of if-lets and casting. And yeah, so I'll try to come up with an example that uses that so I can illustrate the power of SwiftyJSON there. All right, but right now we have our parsePerson SwiftyJSON function. We are using it in our new, our slightly modified getRandomPerson Alamo function. And just to run through it one more time, we get the data from the response using the response.data. We turn that into JSON using the JSON initializer from SwiftyJSON. We pass that into the parsePerson Swifty function, and we go through and we extract all of the values that we need using the very useful .string value and array values, and then just create our person and do the completion. So let's go ahead and run this, make sure it's working. All right, let's press random. And it looks like everything is still working as expected. All right, great. So that is how you can do parsing using SwiftyJSON. All right, so in the next one, we're gonna start learning about Codable. So get excited for that, and I'll see you then.